Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. A time of excess, elegance, and extraordinary privilege. We're diving into what life was really like for the filthy rich during Regency England. Forget the sanitized romances and pristine ballrooms Jane Austen showed you. The truth? Well, it's far more complex, darker, and absolutely fascinating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's 11:30 in the morning, and Lady Charlotte is just now opening her eyes. The heavy velvet curtains are still drawn, blocking out the London sun that's been up for hours. She doesn't pull them open herself, of course. That's what servants are for. 3 of them are already in her room, have been for the past 20 minutes actually, moving silently around her bed like ghosts, preparing for the moment she wakes. They've laid out her morning dress, drawn her bath in the adjoining room, and one holds a silver tray with chocolate, the fashionable breakfast drink that costs more than a labourer's monthly wages. This is how every single day begins for the truly wealthy during the Regency period. And we haven't even gotten to the interesting part yet, the Regency era, technically spanning from 1811 to 1820, when King George III's madness forced his son to rule as Prince Regent, has captured our imagination for over 2 centuries. But the cultural period we think of as Regency actually extends from the 1790s through the 1830s, encompassing a unique moment in British history when the wealthy lived like absolute gods, while the poor died in gutters not 100 yards away from their magnificent townhouses. The wealth gap was staggering, obscene really, and the rich didn't just accept it. They flaunted it, celebrated it, built their entire identity around it. Let's start with the money, because understanding just how rich these people were is essential to grasping the absolute insanity of their lifestyle. A comfortable middle-class family could live quite well on about £200 a year. A clergyman might make £70 annually. A labourer, maybe £20 if he was lucky and stayed employed. Now, consider that the Duke of Devonshire had an annual income of over £70,000. The Duke of Northumberland brought in over £50,000 every single year. These weren't salaries they worked for. This was income from land, from rents, from investments, from coal mines and timber and farms that their ancestors had accumulated over centuries. They didn't work for their money. The money simply appeared, delivered quarterly by their man of business, and they spent it as fast as it came. But here's what really separates the merely wealthy from the truly rich during this period. It wasn't just about having money. It was about having the right kind of money. Money from trade, from manufacturing, from actually working, that was tainted, suspect, not quite respectable, no matter how many millions you'd accumulated. Real wealth came from land, ancient land. Land your family had held since William the Conqueror divvied up England among his Norman buddies back in 1066. The older your title, the mouldier your castle, the more respect you commanded. New money could buy you a nice house and a comfortable life, but it couldn't buy you acceptance into the highest circles of society. That required bloodlines, and bloodlines couldn't be purchased at any price. So what did a typical day actually look like for these people? Well, first, throw out everything you think you know about daily schedules, because the wealthy during the Regency operated on a completely different clock than normal humans. They lived like vampires, honestly. The day began late, very late. Most aristocratic women wouldn't rise until 10 or 11 in the morning, sometimes even noon. The men might get up slightly earlier if they were going riding in Hyde Park, which was the fashionable thing to do, at about 11 in the morning. But even that was considered reasonably early. Let me walk you through Lady Charlotte's morning in more detail, because the sheer excess of it is remarkable. When she finally opens her eyes, her lady's maid is immediately at her side. This isn't just any servant, this is her personal attendant, a woman whose entire existence revolves around Charlotte's body and appearance. The maid helps her sit up, arranges pillows behind her back, and presents that silver tray of chocolate. Charlotte sips it while her maid opens the curtains and begins discussing the day's plans. What will she wear? Who is she visiting? Who is visiting her? What events are scheduled for the evening? After finishing her chocolate, Charlotte rises and moves to her dressing room, which is actually a suite of rooms dedicated entirely to the process of getting dressed. The bath is being prepared in a large copper tub, the water hauled up 3 flights of stairs by housemaids who've been awake since 5 in the morning. The water is scented with oils and rose petals. Charlotte doesn't bathe herself. Her maid does it for her, washing her hair, scrubbing her skin, attending to every inch of her body. We're talking about women who literally never washed themselves, not once in their entire lives. They had no idea how to do it. Why would they? After the bath comes the truly time-consuming part, getting dressed. And when I say time-consuming, I mean it could take 3 to 4 hours to fully dress and prepare a wealthy woman for the day. Let's break down what she's putting on, layer by layer, because this is where you really see the insanity of it all. First, a chemise, a loose linen or cotton undergarment. Then stockings, held up with garters. Then comes the corset, except they didn't call it a corset yet, they called it stays. This is pulled tight, very tight, cinching the waist and pushing up the breasts, creating that distinctive Regency silhouette. Charlotte can't put this on herself. It requires her maid pulling the laces from behind, often with a knee braced against Charlotte's back for leverage. Over the stays goes another layer, sometimes 2, of petticoats. Then finally the dress itself, which during this period is relatively simple compared to other eras. Thank God, because imagine adding the massive skirts of the Victorian era on top of this already ridiculous process. Regency dresses were high-waisted, flowing, made of muslin or silk, often white or in pale colours. They look simple and elegant in paintings, and they were, relatively speaking, but they still required assistance to put on properly. Every hook, every button, every tie was fastened by the lady's maid. But we're not done. Not even close. Now comes the hair. And this is where things get really elaborate. Regency hairstyles for wealthy women were complex arrangements of curls, braids, and ornaments. Hair was curled with hot irons, styled with pomades and oils, decorated with ribbons, feathers, jewels, flowers. For evening events, hair arrangements could reach absolutely absurd heights and complexities, taking hours to construct. Charlotte sits at her dressing table while her maid works, heating irons over a small flame, carefully curling sections of hair, pinning them in place, building the structure curl by curl. Then there's the face. Makeup during the Regency was a controversial topic. Heavy makeup was associated with actresses and prostitutes, so respectable women were supposed to look natural. But of course that natural look required plenty of products. Skin was whitened with powder, sometimes containing lead, which slowly poisoned the user. Cheeks and lips were tinted with rouge, carefully applied to look like a natural flush. Eyebrows were darkened. The goal was to look like you were born with perfect alabaster skin and rosy cheeks, not like you'd spent an hour painting your face. By the time Charlotte is fully dressed and prepared, it's usually 2 or 3 in the afternoon. She's been awake for 3 or 4 hours and hasn't actually done anything yet except get ready to do things. This is her daily life. Every single day, this elaborate ritual repeated. And this was considered normal, expected, just the basic standard of existence for a wealthy woman. Now she's ready to receive visitors or pay calls herself, because the afternoon was dedicated to social visiting. And these visits were serious business, governed by incredibly strict and complex rules that could fill an entire book. You didn't just drop by someone's house. You had to know exactly who you could visit, when you could visit, how long you could stay, what you could discuss. New acquaintances received 15-minute visits. Close friends might warrant 30 minutes. Staying longer was presumptuous and rude. Arriving too early or too late was a social catastrophe. Ladies would dress in their finest, climb into their carriages and spend the afternoon being driven from house to house, leaving calling cards if the person wasn't home or wasn't receiving visitors that day. These calling cards were miniature works of art, engraved with your name and sometimes a personal motto or crest. The quality of your cardstock, the elegance of your engraving, these details were noticed and judged. Everything was noticed and judged. The conversations during these visits were carefully choreographed dances of social intelligence. You had to demonstrate wit without being too clever, which might threaten the men. You had to stay informed about social gossip without appearing to gossip, which was vulgar. You had to compliment without fawning, critique without offending, navigate family alliances and social hierarchies with the skill of a diplomat. One wrong word could damage your reputation. One slip could ostracize you from society. Meanwhile, what were the men doing? Well, if they weren't sleeping off the previous night's drinking, they might be at their club. White's, Boodle's, Brooks's. These were the legendary gentlemen's clubs of St. James's Street, bastions of male privilege where aristocratic men gathered to drink, gamble, eat enormous meals, and conduct the real business of the nation in informal settings. These clubs were extraordinary institutions, and they reveal so much about how the wealthy operated. White's, for instance, was founded in 1693, making it one of the oldest gentlemen's clubs in the world. It was notoriously difficult to join. You had to be proposed by a current member and seconded by another. Then your name went into a book where members could inspect it for weeks. Finally came the vote, conducted with white and black balls dropped into a box. One black ball, just one, and you were rejected, blackballed, which is where we get that term. The humiliation of being blackballed from a club could be socially devastating, and it happened regularly, often for the pettiest of reasons. Inside these clubs, the wealthy lived in a parallel universe of luxury that's hard to fathom. The dining rooms served multiple course meals at all hours. The wine cellars were legendary, stocked with the finest vintages from France, Spain, Portugal. The gambling rooms saw fortunes won and lost on the turn of a card, and we're not talking about pocket change. Members regularly wagered thousands of pounds on a single hand of cards, sometimes tens of thousands. Entire estates changed hands over a game of whist. The famous betting book at White's still exists, and reading through the entries is like peering into an alien world. Gentlemen bet on anything and everything. They bet on which raindrop would reach the bottom of a window first. They bet on whether a man would marry, whether a woman would have a boy or girl, whether a scandal would break, whether someone would die. Yes, really, they took bets on whether people would survive illnesses, with the subjects of the bets sometimes sitting right there in the club, possibly dying while members gambled on the exact date of his demise. The callousness is staggering, but the clubs weren't just about leisure. Real power was brokered in these rooms. Political alliances were formed over dinner. Business deals were struck over brandy. Patronage was distributed. Careers were made or destroyed. All in these exclusive spaces where the right word to the right person could change your life. If you weren't a member, you were shut out of the networks that actually ran the country. Let's talk about the gambling specifically, because the sheer scale of it is mind-boggling. Gambling wasn't a vice or an addiction for the Regency aristocracy. It was a way of life, a mark of status, almost a moral requirement. A gentleman was expected to gamble, and to do so with apparent unconcern for the outcome. Showing distress over losing money was ungentlemanly. You were supposed to lose thousands of pounds with the same calm demeanour you might show when ordering breakfast. Charles James Fox, one of the most prominent politicians of the era, lost over £200,000 gambling before he was 25. £200,000 in the 1770s and 1780s, which would be tens of millions today. He was hardly unique. The memoirs and letters of the period are filled with references to young men of fortune gambling away their entire inheritance in a single night, then shrugging it off and going to dinner. Women gambled too, though usually in different settings. The card tables at private balls and parties saw enormous sums change hands among the ladies. Faro, whist, speculation, these were the games of choice, and women could be just as reckless as men. Lady Archer reportedly lost £4,000 in a single night at the tables. The Duchess of Devonshire Georgiana, one of the most famous women of the late 18th and early Regency period, was a compulsive gambler who accumulated debts of over £3 million in today's money, hiding the extent of her losses from her husband for years. Why this obsession with gambling? Part of it was pure boredom, when you don't have to work, when servants handle every aspect of daily life. When you have unlimited money and limited productive outlets for your energy, gambling provides excitement, risk, drama. It made them feel alive in lives that were otherwise carefully controlled and predictable. But it was also about demonstrating your status. Only the truly wealthy could afford to lose vast sums without concern. Gambling recklessly proved you were so rich that money didn't matter. Now let's talk about the estates, the country houses, because this is where the wealth really showed itself in physical form. The London townhouses were impressive, absolutely, but the country estates were on another level entirely. We're talking about houses with 50, 100, even 200 rooms. Chatsworth, Blenheim Palace, Castle Howard, these weren't homes in any normal sense. They were monuments to wealth and power, buildings designed to awe and intimidate. Take Chatsworth, the seat of the Dukes of Devonshire. The house contains over 125 rooms, spread across an enormous Palladian palace. The painted hall ceiling took 5 years to create. The sculpture gallery housed one of the finest collections of classical art in England. The gardens extended over 100 acres, employing dozens of gardeners to maintain the parterres, fountains, and hothouses. The hothouses, by the way, were technological marvels that allowed the Duke to grow pineapples, bananas, and other exotic fruits in the English climate at enormous expense, purely to show that he could. Blenheim Palace, given to the Duke of Marlborough by a grateful nation after his military victories, is even more absurd. It's not called a palace, ironically. This is the only non-royal, non-episcopal palace in England. It contains 187 rooms. The main facade is 850 feet long. The grounds cover over 2,000 acres. It required a staff of over 200 servants to maintain at its peak. Building it nearly bankrupted the Duke, even with government funding, because the scale of ambition was so vast. Living in these houses was an experience unlike anything we can really imagine today. Guests could stay for weeks or months and explore a different room every day. The public spaces, the staterooms, were designed for entertaining on a massive scale. Ballrooms could accommodate hundreds of dancers. Dining rooms sat 50 or more for formal dinners. Music rooms, libraries, picture galleries, billiard rooms, morning rooms, drawing rooms, smoking rooms, each space had a specific purpose and use. But here's what's remarkable. For all their size, these houses were incredibly uncomfortable by modern standards. They were freezing cold most of the year. Heating a house that large was basically impossible with fireplaces, so you wore layers of clothing indoors and huddled near the fire. They were dark, lit by candles until gas lighting began to be adopted in the 1810s and 1820s, and even then only in the most modern households. They were drafty, damp, and in many cases actively crumbling because the cost of maintaining a building that large exceeded even a wealthy duke's income. The daily life at a country estate followed a different rhythm than London. House parties were the main form of entertainment, and these could last for weeks during the autumn and winter months. A typical house party brought together 20 to 40 guests, all of similar social standing, for an extended stay filled with structured activities. The day began later than in London, if you can believe it. Guests might not appear until noon or even later. Breakfast was an informal affair, laid out on sideboards in the breakfast room, where guests could serve themselves from a bewildering array of options. And when I say array, I mean it. A proper country house breakfast included multiple kinds of eggs, bacon, ham, sausages, kidneys, kippers, cold meats, bread, toast, muffins, preserves, fruits, and various regional specialties. All of this for breakfast. The amount of food was staggering, and much of it went to waste, though the servants would eat the leftovers, so I suppose it wasn't all wasted. After breakfast, the sexes separated. The men went hunting, shooting, or fishing depending on the season. Fox hunting was the prestige sport, an elaborate ritual that combined horsemanship, pageantry, and actual hunting into a day-long event that required specific clothing, specific equipment, and specific mutton, and specific knowledge of incredibly arcane rules and traditions. The hunters would ride out with a pack of hounds, following the master of foxhounds, chasing a fox across the countryside, jumping fences and streams, risking their necks, all for the thrill of the chase. The fox, if caught, was torn apart by the dogs. The brush, or tail, was given to whoever was deemed to have ridden best that day. If it wasn't hunting season, the men might shoot game birds, pheasant, grouse, partridge. These were bred and maintained specifically to be shot by wealthy men. Gamekeepers spent all year raising birds and protecting them from poachers, so that aristocrats could spend a few months shooting them by the hundreds. A good day's shooting might bag 200 or 300 birds. They couldn't possibly eat all of them, so many were given to tenants or sold. But the point wasn't the meat. The point was the sport, the competition, the demonstration of skill and privilege. Meanwhile, the women walked in the gardens, painted watercolors, practiced music, read, or engaged in elaborate needlework. These weren't hobbies pursued out of passion, they were accomplishments, skills that a genteel woman was expected to demonstrate. You had to play the pianoforte or harp adequately, though not too well, which would be unseemly. You had to produce acceptable watercolors and sketches. You had to create delicate embroidery and lacework. You had to speak a bit of French and Italian. You had to know enough about literature and current events to converse intelligently, but not so much that you appeared bookish or unfeminine. The pressure on wealthy women to be accomplished but not too accomplished, educated but not too educated, beautiful but not too vain, was intense and contradictory. You were being constantly evaluated, constantly judged, constantly compared to other women. Your worth was determined by your ability to attract a suitable husband, and suitable meant someone of equal or higher social rank with adequate income. Love was nice if you could get it, but it was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Afternoons at a house party might include more elaborate activities. Riding parties explored the estate. Hunting parties pursued deer or other game. In good weather, there might be archery or lawn games or an expedition to some picturesque ruin on the property. Yes, wealthy landowners sometimes built fake ruins, ancient-looking temples and crumbling towers, purely as decorative elements in their landscape gardens. The most fashion-forward estates were designed by landscape architects like Capability Brown or Humphrey Repton, who reshaped entire valleys, redirected rivers, planted thousands of trees, all to create a naturalistic landscape that looked wild but was actually more carefully controlled than a formal garden. As evening approached, everyone returned to the house to dress for dinner. And now we're back to that elaborate dressing process, except this time it's even more involved, because evening dress was more formal than day dress. Women changed completely into lower-cut gowns, more elaborate hairstyles, more jewelry. Men put on formal evening wear, knee breeches and stockings, tailcoats, carefully tied cravats that took practice and skill to achieve the perfect folds. Dinner was the main event of the day, and it was an elaborate performance. Guests assembled in the drawing room first, where the hostess would arrange the procession into the dining room. This wasn't random. Rank determined everything. The highest-ranking man would escort the hostess, the host would escort the highest-ranking woman, and everyone else paired off in strict order of precedence. Getting this wrong was a serious faux pas that could offend guests and cause social problems. The dining room itself was set like a stage. The table groaned under the weight of silver, crystal, china, and centerpieces. Place settings included multiple forks, knives, and spoons for the different courses. Candlelight reflected off polished surfaces, creating a warm, glittering atmosphere. Servants stood along the walls ready to serve. And the food, oh the food. A formal dinner during the Regency included multiple courses, each with multiple dishes. We're not talking about courses like we think of them today, where one dish comes out, you eat it, then the next arrives. No, each course meant a whole spread of different dishes presented simultaneously. The first course might include 2 soups, a fish dish, several meat dishes, and various side dishes all laid out at once. You didn't eat all of it. You selected what was near you or asked for items to be passed. After the first course was cleared, the second course arrived. More meats, game birds, vegetables, savories. Then the third course, the dessert course, which included sweet dishes, fruits, nuts, ices, creams, jellies, cakes. After that came the final stage, where fruit and nuts remained on the table along with wine for the men, because at this point the women withdrew. This is one of the stranger customs, and it reveals a lot about gender dynamics. After dinner, the ladies left the dining room and retired to the drawing room, where they would have tea or coffee and conversation. The men remained at the table, pushing their chairs closer together, and began the serious drinking and talking. Port, brandy, and other fortified wines circulated. The conversation turned to politics, business, and topics considered unsuitable for female ears. This could go on for hours, with the men getting progressively drunker and louder. Eventually, the men would rejoin the ladies in the drawing room, assuming they could still walk, and the evening's entertainment would begin. This might be music, with ladies performing on the pianoforte or harp while others listened politely. It might be cards, with tables set up for whist or other games. It might be dancing if the party was large enough, or it might simply be conversation, which was considered an art form in itself. People finally retired to bed around midnight or later, often much later, especially if cards were involved. Then the whole cycle would begin again the next day, and the day after that, for the entire length of the house party. Let's talk about the London season now, because this was the absolute peak of aristocratic social life. The annual migration of the wealthy from their country estates to their London townhouses for a few months of concentrated socializing, politicking, and matchmaking. The season ran roughly from Easter to August, though the core of it was April, May, and June. During these months, London was packed with aristocratic families, all there for the same purposes: to see and be seen, to arrange marriages for their children, to participate in the social world that defined their class. The season revolved around a series of recurring events that everyone attended. There were the Queen's drawing rooms, formal presentations at court where debutantes were introduced to society and to the Queen. These were elaborate affairs requiring specific dress, including feathers in your hair and hoops under your skirt. Even though hoops had otherwise gone out of fashion decades earlier, you practiced your curtsy for weeks, because you had to execute a series of 3 curtsies, backing away from the Queen without tripping over your gown or falling over. The pressure was intense, and girls regularly fainted or stumbled, which was mortifying. Then there were the balls. Oh, the balls. All the balls. Almack's Assembly Rooms was the holy of holies, the most exclusive venue in London. Gaining a voucher to attend Almack's required approval from the lady patronesses, a group of powerful aristocratic women who controlled access with absolute authority. They could and did deny vouchers to people they didn't like, or who had committed social infractions, or whose family wasn't quite good enough, or sometimes for no particular reason at all. Being denied a voucher to Almack's was social death for an ambitious family. If you did gain entrance, you found the experience surprisingly disappointing in many ways. The rooms were nice, but not spectacular. The refreshments were notoriously bad: stale bread, weak tea, and orgeat, a kind of almond drink that nobody actually liked. But none of that mattered, because Almack's wasn't about the venue or the food. It was about who was there. This was where the most eligible bachelors and the most marriageable young women gathered. This was where matches were made, where fortunes and titles were united, where the future of aristocratic bloodlines was determined. The dancing at these balls followed strict protocols. A man had to be properly introduced to a woman before asking her to dance. A woman couldn't dance more than 2 dances with the same man, or people would talk, assuming they were forming an attachment. Dance cards listed each dance and your partner, and these cards were examined and gossiped about. Who danced with whom, how often, whether they seemed to enjoy it, all of this was intelligence to be analysed and discussed. The dances themselves were lively and energetic: country dances, cotillions, and the scandalous new waltz, which was considered shockingly intimate because the couple actually held each other while dancing. Many conservative mothers forbade their daughters from waltzing because it was too suggestive. Imagine considering a formal dance where you maintain a foot of distance between you two. Scandalous. That was the Regency for you. Beyond Almack's, there were private balls hosted by wealthy families in their London homes. These could be enormous affairs with hundreds of guests. The ballroom would be decorated with flowers and candles. Musicians would be hired, often a full orchestra. Supper would be served at midnight. Another elaborate multi-course meal. Dancing would continue until 3 or 4 in the morning. The cost of hosting a ball could easily run into thousands of pounds for a single night's entertainment. Then there were the other events that filled the season: Venetian breakfasts, which were neither Venetian nor breakfast but rather afternoon garden parties. Routs, which were overcrowded evening parties where there were so many people you could barely move, and this overcrowding was considered a mark of success. Picnics, though these were elaborate affairs with servants, fine food and wine, not the casual outdoor meals we think of. Theatre performances, opera, concerts, all attended in formal dress, all appended in formal dress, all opportunities to see and be seen. Vauxhall Gardens and Ranelagh were pleasure gardens that offered evening entertainment. For a fee, you could walk the lit paths, listen to music, watch performances, eat in the supper boxes, and enjoy the slightly risque thrill of semi-darkness and relative anonymity. The gardens attracted a mixed crowd, from aristocrats to merchants to people of dubious reputation, and there was always a frisson of danger, a possibility of encountering someone you shouldn't, or being mistaken for someone of loose morals. Young ladies attended only with proper chaperones. Hyde Park was another essential venue, specifically Rotten Row, where the fashionable rodel drove their carriages during the afternoon. This was the place to show off your horsemanship, your carriage, your horses, your clothing. Everyone was on display, and everyone was watching everyone else. The goal was to be seen, to be noticed, to demonstrate that you belonged to this rarefied world. The sheer expense of a London season was crushing. You needed a townhouse in the right neighbourhood, Mayfair ideally. You needed a full staff of servants, including London specialists like footmen in livery. You needed a carriage and horses. You needed an entirely new wardrobe because you couldn't be seen in the same dress twice. You needed to host at least some events yourself. You needed to give your servants extra wages for the season. All of this for just a few months. Estimates vary, but bringing a daughter out for her first season could easily cost £5,000 or more, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. Why spend this absurd amount of money? Because the marriage market required it. If you wanted your daughter to marry well, she needed to be seen, to be socialized, to catch the eye of an eligible man. And eligible meant specific things. He needed a title, or at least be heir to one. He needed an adequate income, generally considered to be at least £1,000 a year minimum, though more was always better. He needed to be acceptable to society, free from major scandals or debts. He needed to be suitable in age, rank, and temperament. The system was mercenary and everyone knew it. Marriages among the aristocracy were business arrangements. Yes, affection might develop, and that was nice, but the primary considerations were money, land, and title. A wealthy heiress might marry an impoverished lord, trading her money for his title. A younger son with no inheritance might seek a merchant's daughter with a large dowry. An old title fallen on hard times might be rescued by marriage to new money. The marriage settlements were complex legal documents that took lawyers weeks to negotiate. They specified the bride's dowry, the groom's income, the widow's portion if he died, the inheritance for future children, the pin money the wife would receive for her personal expenses. Everything was calculated and documented. Romance didn't factor into these negotiations. This was about property and bloodlines. Once married, the lives of aristocratic couples often diverged significantly. Many marriages were cordial but distant. Husband and wife maintained separate bedrooms, separate schedules, sometimes separate residences. The husband might spend much of his time at his club or his mistress's house. The wife presided over the household and the social calendar. They came together for public events, for dinner parties, for appearances, but their private lives were largely independent. Infidelity was common and generally tolerated, with conditions. A husband could keep a mistress. Everyone knew about it. And as long as he was reasonably discreet, it wasn't a scandal. A wife was expected to remain faithful until she had produced an heir and a spare, 2 sons to secure the succession. After that, she might take lovers. And again, if she was discreet, society looked the other way. The key was discretion. Public scandal was unforgivable. Private arrangements were fine as long as they stayed private. Of course, things often didn't stay private. The Regency era was rife with scandals that titillated the public and ruined reputations. Lady Caroline Lamb's affair with Lord Byron was the scandal of 1812, with Caroline publicly throwing herself at Byron, writing him obsessive letters, showing up at his house uninvited, and generally behaving in ways that violated every rule of discretion. When Byron ended the affair, she famously described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. A quote that has outlived both of them. The Prince Regent himself, later George IV, was a scandal factory. His secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act and would have cost him the throne if it had been officially recognised. His later official marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a disaster from the start. He was reportedly drunk at the wedding and spent the night passed out in a fireplace. They conceived 1 child, Princess Charlotte, then separated and spent the rest of his life trying to divorce her. culminating in a public trial in the House of Lords, where her alleged adultery was debated in humiliating detail. The Duke of York, the Prince Regent's brother, was caught up in a scandal involving his mistress Mary Ann Clark, who was selling military commissions and promotions. The Duke claimed he knew nothing about it, but the investigation revealed the sordid details of their relationship and his financial support of her expensive lifestyle. He was forced to resign as Commander-in-Chief of the army, though he was later reinstated. These scandals were eagerly consumed by the reading public through newspapers, satirical prints, and gossip. The prints were especially vicious, with artists like James Gilray creating elaborately detailed caricatures that mocked the wealthy and powerful. The Prince Regent was a favorite target, depicted as enormously fat, ridiculously vain, and wastefully extravagant. These prints were displayed in shop windows where anyone could see them, and they were quite popular among all classes. Let's talk about what the wealthy actually ate, because the food culture of the Regency wealthy is fascinating and often disgusting. We've touched on the multi-course dinners, but let's go deeper into what was actually on those plates. First, understand that variety and exoticism were the points. The more unusual the ingredient, the more elaborate the preparation, the better. Displaying rare and expensive foods showed your wealth and sophistication. Meat was the centerpiece of most meals, and there was so much meat. A dinner might include beef, mutton, pork, venison, game birds like pheasant or grouse, domestic birds like chicken or goose, duck, pigeon, and more. These weren't small portions either. A roast might be an entire haunch of venison or a whole side of beef. The excess was intentional and conspicuous. But here's where it gets interesting. The Regency wealthy also ate things we'd find bizarre or repulsive today. Turtle soup was an enormous delicacy, made from actual sea turtles imported alive from the Caribbean at great expense. The turtles were kept in tanks until needed, then slaughtered and made into a rich, gelatinous soup that was considered the height of luxury. Killing and preparing a turtle was a complex, skilled process, and the resulting soup was served at only the most important dinners. They ate ortolans, tiny songbirds that were captured, fattened, drowned in brandy, roasted and eaten whole, bones and all. They ate larks, similarly prepared. They ate unusual cuts and organ meats that we'd reject today. Calf's head was a delicacy, served with the eyes still in. Pig's trotters, cow's udders, lamb's fries, which are testicles. All of these appeared on wealthy tables. Fish was less prestigious than meat, but still featured prominently. Turbot was especially prized, as were sole, salmon, and pike. Oysters were incredibly popular and relatively cheap, eaten by the dozen as a starter. Lobster, crab, and other shellfish were common. Fresh fish was a challenge in London, since refrigeration didn't exist, so fish was often kept alive in tanks or packed in ice hauled from ice houses on estates. The sweet dishes were elaborate confections of sugar, cream, and fruit, jellies in elaborate molds, some clear, some opaque, some in multiple colored layers. Syllabubs, a kind of whipped cream dessert. Trifles with layers of cake, custard, and fruit. Ices, the precursor to ice cream, made by hand cranking a mixture in a container surrounded by ice and salt. Pineapples, which had to be grown in hothouses in England at enormous expense, were the ultimate status symbol. A single pineapple could cost the equivalent of a carriage. The waste from these meals was staggering. Guests rarely ate more than a fraction of what was served. The rest went to the servants, who ate very well in wealthy households, at least compared to the general population. Still, enormous amounts of food were simply thrown away, all to demonstrate that the host could afford to waste it. Drinking culture was its own universe. Wine flowed constantly. Port, sherry, Madeira, claret, these fortified and red wines were staples. A gentleman might easily consume multiple bottles in a day, and serious drinkers consumed far more. The Prince Regent was legendary for his alcohol consumption, regularly drinking until he passed out. This wasn't considered a vice. This was normal, expected behavior for aristocratic men. Women drank too, though they were expected to be more moderate. Champagne was becoming fashionable for ladies. Sweet wines like ratafia were popular, but heavy drinking by women was frowned upon. Another double standard in a society full of them. The water, by the way, was generally unsafe to drink. especially in London. Tea, coffee, and small beer, a low-alcohol beer consumed throughout the day, were safer alternatives. The wealthy drank imported tea from China and coffee from the Caribbean, both expensive commodities that were marks of status. Now let's examine the fashion in more detail, because the clothes of the Regency wealthy were works of art and instruments of social signaling. We've discussed the basic process of dressing, but what were they actually wearing, and what did it mean? For women, the Regency silhouette was all about the high waist, just under the bust, with a long, flowing skirt. This was the Empire waist, named after the French Empire style that influenced fashion across Europe. The look was classical, inspired by ancient Greek and Roman clothing, which fit perfectly with the neoclassical aesthetic that dominated Regency culture. The fabrics were crucial. Muslin was the most fashionable choice, a fine cotton imported from India at considerable expense. The best muslin was incredibly sheer and delicate, almost transparent, which caused scandals and satirical commentary about women basically wearing their nightgowns in public. Silk was also popular, especially for evening wear. Satin, velvet, and lace served as accents and trims. Colors varied by occasion and year, as fashion changed constantly. White and pale colors, cream, light pink, light blue, were especially popular for young, unmarried women. These colors suggested purity and innocence. Married women could wear richer, deeper colors. Older women often wore darker shades. But fashion could shift, and what was stylish one season might be hopelessly outdated the next. The expense of maintaining a fashionable wardrobe was enormous. Fabrics were costly, and the delicate muslins wore out quickly. A woman needed different dresses for different times of day and different occasions. Morning dresses, walking dresses, carriage dresses, dinner dresses, ball gowns, each had specific characteristics. You couldn't wear a morning dress to a ball or a ball gown to breakfast. Having enough dresses to navigate a London season without repetition required a huge wardrobe. Accessories were equally important and expensive. Shawls, especially fine cashmere shawls imported from India, were essential fashion items that could cost hundreds of pounds. Gloves were worn constantly, and you needed many pairs since they soiled easily. Slippers, usually made of soft leather or fabric, wore out rapidly. Bonnets and hats for outdoor wear came in endless varieties. Fans, reticules, which were small handbags, parasols, all the little items that completed an outfit. Jewelry was another marker of status. Diamonds, pearls, emeralds, rubies, set in gold or silver, worn as necklaces, bracelets, earrings, brooches, hair ornaments. The most valuable pieces were family heirlooms, passed down through generations, sometimes with specific pieces legally entailed to go with a title. New pieces were commissioned from jewelers for special occasions. The value of a single necklace could exceed the annual income of a middle-class family. Men's fashion was equally expensive, though less obviously varied. The Regency was the age of Beau Brummel, the arbiter of male fashion who elevated dressing into an art form. Brummel's philosophy was that a gentleman should be impeccably dressed, but not ostentatious. The fit and quality of the clothing mattered more than decoration. A gentleman's wardrobe centered on tailoring. The coat had to fit perfectly across the shoulders, with the collar sitting just right at the back of the neck. Achieving this required multiple fittings with a skilled tailor. Tailors like Weston or Stultz were famous and expensive, and men waited weeks for their coats. The coat was usually dark blue, black or brown, made of fine wool. The cut was fitted through the body with tails in back. Underneath the coat, a waistcoat, which could be more colourful and decorative. Then a shirt, always white, made of fine linen. The cravat, the neckcloth, was tied in elaborate styles that required skill and practice. Beau Brummel reportedly spent hours tying his cravat, going through multiple starched cloths until he achieved the perfect folds. His floor would be littered with discarded cravats, failures in his quest for perfection. Breeches or pantaloons covered the legs, usually in a light colour, buff or white, fitted tightly to show the shape of the leg. This required men to have good legs, and some resorted to padding or even corsets to achieve the right silhouette. Stockings and shoes or boots for riding completed the outfit. Hessian boots, which came to just below the knee with a tassel at the top, were especially fashionable. The male wardrobe required constant renewal and care. White shirts showed dirt instantly and had to be laundered frequently. The tight-fitting breeches and pantaloons wore out at the seams. Boots required polishing to a high shine, which was a servant's job. A gentleman might own dozens of shirts, multiple coats for different occasions, many pairs of breeches, and several pairs of boots. The cost added up. A single coat from a fashionable tailor could cost £50 or more. Boots were expensive. Fine linen for shirts was pricey. A gentleman establishing his wardrobe could easily spend thousands of pounds, and that's not counting the ongoing costs of replacement and maintenance. Both men and women use cosmetics and treatments we'd find alarming today. We mentioned lead-based face powder for women, which gave that desirable pale complexion, while slowly causing lead poisoning. Belladonna drops were used to dilate the pupils, making the eyes look larger and more luminous, but also causing vision problems and other health issues. Various creams and lotions promised to beautify the skin, and many contained mercury or other toxic substances. Men used hair products extensively. Macassar oil was popular for slicking back hair, so popular that it led to antimacassars, the cloths placed on chairbacks to protect them from hair oil stains. Some men coloured their hair or used pomades and powders. Wigs had gone out of fashion by the Regency, but hairpieces and enhancements were still used by men going bald. Personal hygiene was not what we'd consider adequate today. Full baths were rare, maybe once a week or less. Daily washing was usually limited to the face, hands, and sometimes the feet. Deodorant didn't exist. People smelled of sweat, perfume, and the various powders and pomades they used. Teeth were cleaned with tooth powder and cloths, but dental care was primitive and many people had terrible teeth. Dentists existed, but their methods were crude. Toothaches were treated with extraction, often without effective anesthesia. The wealthy had access to better medical care than the poor, but medical care in the Regency era was often worse than no care at all. Physicians had prestige but limited actual knowledge. They prescribed mercury for various ailments which poisoned patients. They bled people, thinking it balanced the humours, which weakened already sick patients and sometimes killed them. They prescribed laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, for everything from headaches to coughs to sleeplessness, creating widespread addiction among the upper classes. Surgeons had lower status than physicians, but were often more practical. They could set bones, amputate limbs, remove bladder stones, and perform other operations, all without effective anesthesia, beyond alcohol or opium. Survival rates were poor, and infections killed many who survived the initial procedure. Women's health was particularly poorly understood. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, with maternal mortality rates that would be shocking today. Wealthy women had access to expensive doctors and midwives. But this sometimes made things worse because these practitioners often had strange ideas about how to manage birth. Wealthy women were encouraged to lie still and be passive during labor, while working-class women who moved around and followed their instincts often fared better. Many wealthy women died in childbirth or from complications afterward. Many babies died in infancy. It was common for a woman to have 8 or 10 pregnancies and raise only 3 or 4 children to adulthood. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and then pregnancy again wore women down. Contraception was unreliable and often unknown. Families were large partly because there was no effective way to prevent pregnancy. Let's talk about childhood for the wealthy, because it was a strange experience, completely different from modern childhood. First, wealthy babies were usually not raised by their mothers. A wet nurse, a woman hired to breastfeed the baby, was standard practice. The mother might visit the nursery but didn't provide day-to-day care. Nurses, nannies, and nursemaids handled the actual work of feeding, changing, and watching the children. As children grew, they remained largely separated from their parents. They lived in the nursery with their nurses, had meals there, played there, slept there. They might be brought to see their parents for an hour a day, usually in the late afternoon or early evening, dressed in their best clothes and expected to be on their best behavior. Then they were returned to the nursery. Some parents were more involved, but many aristocratic parents barely knew their children. Education for boys meant tutors at home until around age 7 or 8, then boarding school, Eton, Harrow, Westminster, These elite schools took boys from wealthy families and subjected them to a brutal regime of classical education, physical punishment, bullying by older boys, and harsh living conditions. The idea was to toughen them up, prepare them for leadership, teach them Latin and Greek and mathematics. In practice, it was often miserable. After boarding school came university, usually Oxford or Cambridge, though not everyone completed a degree. University was more about social connections than education for aristocratic young men. They joined clubs, made friends with other wealthy young men, drank, gambled, and occasionally attended lectures. The connections made at university lasted a lifetime and facilitated the network of patronage and privilege that defined the upper class. Girls were educated at home by governesses. They learned what were called accomplishments: music, drawing, watercolors, needlework, dancing, languages, enough history and literature to converse intelligently. They were not given the same rigorous classical education as boys. Universities didn't admit women. The goal of female education was to prepare girls for marriage, to make them attractive wives who could run a household, entertain guests, and raise children. Some families sent daughters to boarding schools for young ladies, where they received similar training in a group setting. These schools emphasized deportment, manners, and accomplishments. The quality varied widely, and some were basically finishing schools that taught girls to look pretty and dance gracefully without much substance. The transition to adulthood was marked by coming out, being presented at court, and entering society. For girls, this happened around age 17 or 18 and marked their availability on the marriage market. For boys, coming of age at 21 meant assuming control of their inheritance if their father had died, or receiving an allowance if he hadn't. Young aristocratic men often went on a grand tour, traveling through Europe to see art, architecture, and classical ruins, especially in Italy and Greece. This was considered an essential part of education for a gentleman. The tour could last months or even years. Young men traveled with a tutor or companion, visited museums and galleries, bought art and antiquities to ship home, and generally soaked up culture. They also often had affairs, gambled, drank, and engaged in the usual young male foolishness in foreign cities. The grand tour was interrupted by the Napoleonic Wars, which made European travel difficult or impossible from the 1790s through 1815. When the wars ended, there was a surge of British tourists flooding onto the continent, eager to resume this traditional rite of passage. Now let's discuss the servants, because you cannot understand the lives of the wealthy without understanding the army of servants that made those lives possible. A wealthy aristocratic household might employ 50, 100, even 200 servants depending on the size of the establishment. These people were invisible to the family in many ways, but absolutely essential. The servant hierarchy was complex and rigid. At the top was the butler, the senior male servant who oversaw the male staff, managed the wine cellar, supervised service at meals, and acted as the master's personal attendant. The butler was a position of prestige and relatively good pay. A butler in a great house might earn £60 to £80 a year, plus room, board, and clothing, which was quite good. The housekeeper was the senior female servant, overseeing the female staff, managing the household accounts, maintaining the linens and household goods, and ensuring the house ran smoothly. She ranked just below the butler and often worked closely with him. Her income was similar to the butler's, and she had significant authority. Below them were various ranks of servants with specific roles. Footmen served at table, opened doors, accompanied the family on outings, and provided a decorative element. Yes, decorative. Footmen were often hired partly for their appearance. Tall, handsome young men in elegant livery added to the visual prestige of the household. They might earn £20 to £30 a year. Ladies' maids attended to the personal needs of the lady of the house and her daughters. They dressed them, styled their hair, maintained their clothes, and travelled with them. A skilled lady's maid could earn £30 to £40 a year and might receive her lady's cast-off clothing, which she could sell or remake. Valets served the same role for men, maintaining clothes, shaving and grooming their masters, packing for trips. They were privy to their master's secrets and expected to be absolutely discreet. Housemaids cleaned a house, an endless task in houses with dozens of rooms. They started work before dawn, lighting fires, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, dusting, making beds, and 1,000 other tasks. They were among the lowest paid servants, earning maybe £8 to £12 a year, and they worked incredibly hard. Kitchen staff included the cook, who was relatively senior and well paid, especially if skilled. A top cook could command £50 a year or more. Under the cook were kitchen maids who prepared vegetables, washed dishes, and did the heavy labor of the kitchen. Grooms and stable staff cared for the horses, maintained the carriages, and drove when needed. Gardeners maintained the grounds. Gamekeepers managed the game birds and prevented poaching. On large estates there were also estate workers, farmers who rented land, laborers who worked the fields, and various craftsmen and specialists. Living as a servant in a wealthy household was better than many alternatives. You had food, shelter, and clothing provided. You were protected from destitution. If you worked in a prestigious household, you had job security and the potential to rise through the ranks. But it was also restrictive and demanding. Servants worked long hours, often 16 or 18 hours a day. They were always on call. They had limited free time and almost no privacy. Female servants were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation by the men of the house. A male employer or his sons might view the maids as available for their pleasure, and a servant who became pregnant was usually dismissed without a reference, which made finding other employment nearly impossible. The relationship between servants and employers was complex. On one hand, there was genuine affection in some cases. A lady's maid might be with her mistress for decades, becoming a trusted confidant. A butler might serve the same family his entire career and be treated almost like a family member. On the other hand, there was a vast gulf of power and status. A servant could be dismissed for minor infractions, and a dismissal without a character reference meant potential unemployment and poverty. The servants' entrance, servant scares, and servants' quarters were physically separated from the family spaces. Servants were supposed to be invisible, to appear when needed and vanish when not. There are stories of servants flattening themselves against walls or ducking into alcoves to avoid being seen by family members. The architecture of great houses included hidden passages and stairs so servants could move through the house without being observed. Despite this, servants knew everything about the family. They dressed them, cleaned their rooms, served their meals, listened to their conversations. Servants' gossip networks spread information rapidly through the household and beyond. A lady's maid from one house visiting another house while traveling with her mistress might share information with servants there, and news spread through the servant network faster than through official channels. Some servants parlayed their positions into better situations. A talented cook might be hired away by another family for higher pay. A butler or housekeeper might save money and eventually retire with enough to live modestly. A lady's maid might receive a legacy in her mistress's will, but many servants worked their entire lives and ended up with little, supported by their former employer's charity, or ending up in the poorhouse if they were unlucky. Let's turn to the topic of money management and estates, because the way the wealthy handled their finances was both sophisticated and often disastrous. The income we discussed earlier, those tens of thousands of pounds annually, that money came from complex systems of land ownership, rents, and investments. The basis was land. An aristocratic estate consisted of thousands of acres, usually spread across multiple properties. Some of this land was farmed directly by the estate with hired labourers. Most was rented to tenant farmers who paid annual rents. The estate also might include timber that could be harvested and sold, mineral rights that could be leased to mining companies and other resources. Managing all this required professional help. The man of business was essentially a financial manager who collected rents, paid bills, oversaw investments, and kept accounts. Land agents managed the day-to-day operations of the estate, dealing with tenants, organizing repairs, and maximizing income. Lawyers handled legal matters, which were constant given the complex inheritance laws and frequent disputes. The income was substantial but not always liquid. Rents came quarterly. Investments paid dividends on schedules. A family might be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds on paper, but have limited ready cash on hand. This led to borrowing, and many aristocratic families carried substantial debts despite their theoretical wealth. The most common form of borrowing was the mortgage. Land could be mortgaged to raise cash, with the loan secured against the property. Interest had to be paid regularly. and if the mortgage wasn't eventually paid off, the property could be foreclosed. Many estates carried mortgages for generations, with the interest payments simply becoming another regular expense. There were also personal loans from banks or moneylenders. These often came with high interest rates and could spiral out of control if not managed carefully. We mentioned earlier the vast gambling debts some men accumulated. These debts were often to other gentlemen, and failing to pay them was a serious matter of honor. A man who didn't pay his gambling debts was ostracized from society. The legal structure of aristocratic wealth was designed to preserve estates intact across generations. Entail was the key mechanism. An entailed estate was legally restricted to pass to a specific line of heirs, usually the eldest son and his eldest son and his eldest son after him. The current owner couldn't sell the entailed land or divide it. He was essentially a life tenant, with the responsibility to maintain the estate and pass it to the next generation. This system ensured that estates remained large and intact, but it also created problems. Younger sons inherited nothing except maybe a small allowance. Daughters received marriage portions, dowries, but no land. If there were no male heirs, the estate might pass to a distant cousin, leaving the widow and daughters with limited support. Widows were protected by jointures, legal agreements that provided income for life after the husband's death. Daughters received portions, lump sums that served as dowries. Younger sons might receive an allowance or a lump sum to establish themselves in a career or buy a commission in the army, but the bulk of the wealth went to the eldest son, creating a system that privileged primogeniture and male inheritance absolutely. This system created a class of younger sons who had status but limited money. They needed to find careers, and the acceptable options were limited. The church was one path. Many younger sons became clergymen, taking livings, which were church positions that came with income, on estates belonging to their family or friends. The military was another option. Buying a commission in the army or navy and pursuing a military career was respectable. The law was acceptable. Becoming a barrister or solicitor was a career path for a gentleman's younger son. What wasn't acceptable was trade or commerce. Actually working in business, getting involved in manufacturing or retail, that was beneath a gentleman. If a younger son went into business, he lost status and his family often distanced themselves from him. The prejudice against trade was strong and irrational, but it was real. The daughters of wealthy families faced their own constraints. Their primary job was to marry well. A woman from an aristocratic family with a good dowry could attract a suitable husband, someone of similar rank who could support her in the lifestyle she was accustomed to. Marriage was her career, her life's purpose as society saw it. Women had almost no legal rights once married. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't control her own money. Everything belonged to her husband. He could spend her dowry, sell her jewelry, use her money as he wished. If he was kind and responsible, this might work out fine. If he was cruel or irresponsible, she had little recourse. Wealthy families tried to protect daughters through marriage settlements that placed some money in trust for the wife's use, but the husband still controlled most of her wealth. Divorce was nearly impossible. It required an Act of Parliament and was scandalously expensive and difficult. Only a handful of divorces occurred during the entire Regency period. A woman trapped in a bad marriage was stuck unless she was willing to separate, which meant social ruin and financial hardship. Widowhood was actually the freest state for a wealthy woman. A widow had her jointure, her own income. She wasn't under her father's control anymore and didn't have a husband to obey. She could live independently, manage her own household, make her own decisions. Wealthy widows wielded significant social power, and some chose not to remarry precisely because they valued their independence. Let's talk about the political power of the wealthy, because economic power translated directly into political power during this period. The aristocracy didn't just have money, they controlled the government. The House of Lords was the upper chamber of Parliament, and membership was hereditary for peers. Dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts and barons sat in the Lords by right of their titles. They could debate and vote on legislation. The Lords could veto bills from the Commons. Though this power was limited in practice for financial matters, still, no major legislation passed without the Lords' approval. The House of Commons was theoretically representative, but in practice, it was largely controlled by the wealthy. Many constituencies were pocket boroughs, seats where a single wealthy patron controlled who got elected. He might own most of the land in the district, making him the landlord of most of the voters, or the constituency might have very few voters, sometimes just a handful, who voted as they were told in exchange for money or favours. Rotten boroughs were even more absurd. These were constituencies that had lost most of their population but still sent members to Parliament. Old Surham was the most famous example, an empty hill with no inhabitants that still elected 2 MPs, controlled by whoever owned the land. Dunwich had mostly fallen into the sea but still elected representatives. Wealthy aristocrats controlled dozens of seats through their influence over these boroughs. The Duke of Newcastle reportedly controlled 7 seats in Parliament through his various pocket boroughs. This allowed aristocratic families to ensure their interests were represented and their allies were in power. Elections in constituencies with actual voters were often corrupt affairs. Candidates bought votes openly, offering money, food, drink and favours in exchange for support. Elections could be violent, with rival mobs fighting in the streets. The whole process was chaotic and unfair, heavily weighted toward the wealthy. Once in Parliament, members pursued policies that benefited their class. The Corn Laws, for instance, restricted imports of grain to keep prices high, benefiting landowners who grew grain at the expense of everyone else who had to buy it. Game laws made it illegal for common people to hunt game, even on their own land, preserving hunting as an aristocratic privilege. Enclosure acts allowed landowners to fence off common land that villagers had traditionally used, forcing many into poverty, while increasing the landowner's control. The aristocracy also dominated local government. Justices of the peace were unpaid positions held by local gentry and aristocrats. They had broad powers to enforce laws, judge minor crimes, and administer local affairs. A JP could sentence someone to jail, order them whipped, or transport them to Australia for stealing a loaf of bread. The power was enormous and often abused. The wealthy also controlled patronage, the system of appointing people to government positions. Jobs in the customs office, tax collection, colonial administration, military commissions, church livings, all of these were in the gift of powerful men. They awarded these positions to relatives, friends, supporters, and clients, building networks of obligation and loyalty. If you wanted a position, you needed a patron, and getting a patron meant making yourself useful to someone powerful. This system was fundamentally corrupt and undemocratic, but it persisted because those with the power to change it benefited from it. Reform efforts were resisted fiercely by the aristocracy. The Great Reform Act wouldn't pass until 1832, and even then it only modestly expanded voting rights and eliminated some of the worst rotten boroughs. Real democracy was still decades away. The contrast between the lives of the wealthy and the lives of the poor during this same period is almost impossible to comprehend. While aristocrats slept until noon in feather beds, labourers rose before dawn to work 16-hour days in factories or fields. While the rich ate multi-course meals and threw away the leftovers, the poor survived on bread, porridge and potatoes, and many went hungry. While the wealthy owned multiple houses filled with luxuries, the poor lived in cramped, filthy slums where entire families shared a single room with no sanitation. The London slums were nightmarish. St Mamarish, Giles, the Seven Dials, the East End, these areas were overcrowded, disease-ridden, dangerous. Buildings were decrepit, threatening to collapse. Raw sewage ran in the streets. Water came from contaminated wells and pumps. Cholera, typhoid, and other diseases swept through regularly, killing thousands. Infant mortality was staggering, with half of children dying before age 5 in the worst areas. The working poor laboured in brutal conditions for wages that barely sustained life. Factory workers, including children as young as 5 or 6, worked 12 to 16 hours a day, operating dangerous machinery in poorly ventilated buildings. Injuries were common, and there was no compensation or support for injured workers. Mines employed children to crawl through narrow passages hauling coal. Agricultural labourers worked seasonally, facing unemployment and starvation in winter. Women and children worked because families needed every possible income. a working-class family might have the father, mother, and several children all working and still barely scrape by. Women worked in factories, as domestic servants in middle-class homes, as laundresses, seamstresses, street vendors. The pay was less than men received for the same work. Child labor was ubiquitous and horrific. Children worked in textile mills, breathing cotton dust that damaged their lungs. They worked in mines, developing twisted spines from crawling in low passages. They worked as chimney sweeps, sent up narrow, hot chimneys where they sometimes got stuck and suffocated. Reformers were beginning to agitate against the worst abuses, but it would take decades for meaningful protections to be enacted. The poor had no safety net. If you couldn't work, you had three options: charity, crime, or the workhouse. Charity was limited and inconsistent. The workhouse was a deliberate horror, designed to be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would enter. Families were separated, men from women, children from parents. The work was hard. The food was minimal. The conditions were prison-like. Many preferred to starve in the streets rather than enter the workhouse. Crime was rampant, driven by desperation, theft, prostitution, pickpocketing. These were survival strategies for people with no other options. The legal system responded with harsh punishments. Hundreds of crimes carried the death penalty, from murder to stealing a sheep. Executions were public spectacles, with crowds gathering to watch people hanged at Tyburn or later at Newgate Prison. Transportation to Australia was another common sentence, essentially exiling criminals to the other side of the world for years or life. The wealthy were aware of the poor, of course. They couldn't avoid seeing poverty in the streets, but there was little sense of responsibility or obligation to address systemic problems. Poverty was seen as a moral failing, the result of laziness or vice. If people were poor, it was their own fault. This attitude allowed the wealthy to enjoy their excess without guilt. Some engaged in charity, which was considered admirable. Building a hospital, endowing a school, distributing food or money to the deserving poor, these were respectable activities for wealthy philanthropists. But charity was selective and paternalistic. The deserving poor were those who were poor through no fault of their own: widows, orphans, the disabled. The undeserving poor, which included most able-bodied men who couldn't find work, were viewed with contempt. The social distance between the classes was vast. Aristocrats rarely encountered working-class people except as servants, and servants were trained to be invisible and subservient. The lives of the poor were abstract, distant, not quite real. It was possible to live in London surrounded by poverty and never truly see it, never engage with it in any meaningful way. This brings us to the question of awareness and conscience. Did the wealthy know how unjust the system was? Did they care? The answer is complicated. Some genuinely believed in the natural order of society, that God had ordained a hierarchy with aristocrats at the top and labourers at the bottom. Everyone had their place, and disrupting this order would lead to chaos. This wasn't cynical rationalization. Many truly believed it. Others were more aware and more troubled. There were aristocratic reformers who pushed for better treatment of the poor, for factory regulations, for political reform. William Wilberforce, himself from a wealthy family, led the movement to abolish the slave trade and then slavery itself throughout the British Empire. Robert Owen experimented with better working conditions in his factories. These reformers were exceptional, but they existed. The intellectual climate was shifting too. Enlightenment ideas about human rights, equality, and liberty were circulating. The French Revolution had shown that the old order could be overthrown, which both inspired and terrified the British aristocracy. The spectre of revolution haunted them, especially in the 1790s and early 1800s, when war with France made radical ideas seem like existential threats. The government responded to potential unrest with repression. The Combination Acts outlawed trade unions and workers organizing for better conditions. Habeas corpus was suspended, allowing the government to imprison people without trial. Spies infiltrated radical groups. The Peterloo massacre in 1819 saw cavalry charging a peaceful protest in Manchester, killing 15 people and injuring hundreds. The government defended this action and cracked down further on dissent. The wealthy were afraid, and that fear made them more defensive and less willing to reform. They saw any challenge to their privileges as the first step toward revolution and ruin. This paranoia shaped politics throughout the Regency period and beyond. Let's return to the personal lives of the wealthy and discuss some specific examples, because individual stories illustrate the general patterns in vivid detail. The Duchess of Devonshire, Georgiana Spencer, was one of the most famous women of the late 18th and early Regency period. She married the Duke of Devonshire at 17 in 1774, one of the most eligible matches of the era. She was beautiful, charming, intelligent, and fashionable. She became a leader of society, setting trends in clothing, hosting famous salons, and actively participating in politics, which was unusual for a woman. But her life was also troubled. Her husband was cold and distant, far more interested in his mistress than his wife. Georgiana developed a serious gambling addiction, accumulating enormous debts that she hid from her husband for years. She had a complicated relationship with her husband's mistress, Lady Elizabeth Foster, who lived with them in a bizarre ménage à trois arrangement. Georgiana had affairs, including one with the future Prime Minister Charles Grey, and had an illegitimate daughter who was taken from her and raised secretly. She struggled with her public role and private unhappiness, used laudanum and alcohol, and died at age 48 in 1806, worn out by the stresses of her life. Her story shows that wealth and status didn't guarantee happiness, and that aristocratic women faced their own forms of constraint and suffering. The Prince Regent himself, George IV, embodied both the splendor and the excess of the Regency. He was intelligent, cultured, a patron of the arts who supported artists, musicians, and architects. He oversaw the transformation of London, commissioning Regent Street and Regent's Park. He built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, a fantastical pleasure palace in an exotic Indo-Islamic style. He collected art and furniture, and his collections formed the basis of important museum holdings. He was also vain, self-indulgent, and often cruel. He spent money with no regard for budgets, running up debts of hundreds of thousands of pounds that Parliament had to cover. He was a glutton, eating and drinking to excess until he became enormously fat and plagued by health problems. His treatment of his wife Caroline was vindictive and public. He tried to exclude her from his coronation in 1821, leading to a humiliating scene where she was turned away from Westminster Abbey. His father George III was mad, probably suffering from porphyria, a metabolic disorder that caused both physical and mental symptoms. By 1811, the king was permanently incapacitated, living in seclusion at Windsor, blind and delusional. This was why the Regency was necessary. The prince had waited his entire life to wield real power, and when he finally got it, he used it largely for personal pleasure and aesthetic projects rather than governance. Beau Brummel, mentioned earlier as the arbiter of fashion, is another fascinating figure. He wasn't aristocratic by birth. His father was a government clerk, but Brummel used his wit, style, and personality to become an intimate friend of the Prince Regent and the most influential man in fashionable society. He dictated what men wore, how they behaved, what was acceptable and what wasn't. His influence was based entirely on personality and taste, not wealth or title. He lived far beyond his means, maintaining an expensive lifestyle on credit and gambling winnings. When his luck turned and his debts mounted, he fled to France in 1816 to escape creditors. He spent his final years in poverty in Caen, dying in a madhouse in 1840, forgotten by the society he once ruled. His rise and fall illustrate the precariousness of social position based on fashion and favour, rather than inherited wealth. It also shows that the Regency aristocracy was permeable in some ways. A clever, charming person could rise to the heights, though maintaining that position was nearly impossible without real money. Lord Byron, the poet, was another complicated figure. He inherited his title as a child, and struggled with poverty and debt in his early years despite being a baron. He became famous overnight with the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in 1812. He was celebrated for his poetry, his looks, his romantic adventures, and his scandalous behaviour. His affair with Lady Caroline Lamb was the scandal of 1812, as mentioned earlier. Rumours of an incestuous relationship with his half-sister Augusta Lee circulated. His marriage to Annabella Milbanke in 1815 collapsed after a year, with Annabella leaving him amid rumours of cruelty, infidelity, and possible insanity. The scandal drove Byron from England in 1816. He never returned, spending his remaining years in Italy and Greece, where he died in 1824 while supporting Greek independence. Byron's poetry captured the romantic spirit of the age, celebrating passion, individualism, and rebellion against social conventions. His life embodied the same themes. He was both celebrated and condemned, admired and reviled. His legacy is complex, recognizing his genius while acknowledging his cruelty and self-destructiveness. Jane Austen offers a different perspective on Regency life, that of the genteel but not wealthy. She came from a respectable family. Her father was a clergyman, but they had limited money. She and her sister never married, and after their father's death they depended on the financial support of their brothers. This precarious genteel poverty shapes her novels, which focus on the economic pressures facing women who needed to marry well to secure their futures. Her novels are often read as romances, and they are, but they're also sharp social commentary on the marriage market, the constraints on women, the importance of money, and the absurdities of social hierarchy. She wrote about the world she knew, the country gentry and minor aristocracy, with wit and insight. Her work wasn't taken seriously by the literary establishment during her life, but she earned some money from her writing and achieved modest recognition before her death in 1817 at age 41. These individual stories remind us that behind the general patterns were real people with complex lives, facing both privileges and pressures that shaped their choices and experiences. As the Regency period drew to a close in the 1820s, changes were coming. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating, creating new forms of wealth and new social classes. The middle class was growing, demanding political voice and social respect. The working class was beginning to organize despite repression. Reform movements were gaining strength. The aristocracy would remain powerful for decades to come, but their absolute dominance was being challenged. The Reform Act of 1832 would expand voting rights and eliminate some Rossen boroughs. The Corn Laws would eventually be repealed. Regulations would slowly improve working conditions. Slavery would be abolished throughout the empire in 1833. The Regency itself ended when George III died in 1820 and the Prince Regent became George IV. His reign lasted until 1830, marked by continued excess and declining popularity. His death and the succession of his brother William IV marked another transition. The Victorian era that followed would have a very different character, more moralistic, more reform-minded, though still deeply unequal. Looking back at the Regency wealthy, we see a class at the height of its power and luxury, living lives of extraordinary privilege built on systems of inherited wealth, political control, and social hierarchy. They created beautiful art and architecture, supported culture, and lived with elegance and style. They also exploited workers, ignored poverty, resisted reform, and defended injustice to preserve their position. Their world is both fascinating and appalling. The clothes, the balls, the estates, the romance of it appeals to us. We read Jane Austen, watch period dramas, and imagine ourselves in beautiful gowns dancing at assemblies. But the reality included cruelty, inequality, and a fundamental disregard for human dignity outside their narrow class. Understanding what life was really like for the filthy rich during Regency England means holding both truths simultaneously. Yes, it was a time of elegance and cultural achievement. It was also a time of profound injustice, where a tiny minority lived like royalty while the majority struggled to survive. The wealth, the power, the privilege, all of it was built on the labor and suffering of others, a fact the wealthy conveniently ignored as they dressed for dinner and danced until dawn. The Regency period ended, but the patterns it exemplified, extreme wealth concentration, political power protecting economic interests, social systems that favor the privileged, these patterns persist in different forms today. Studying the past helps us recognize these patterns in the present, and maybe, just maybe, make different choices about the future. So the next time you watch a Regency romance or read a novel set in this period, enjoy the story, appreciate the aesthetics, but remember the reality beneath the fiction. Remember the servants rising before dawn, the children working in mines, the women trapped in loveless marriages, the men destroying themselves with drink and gambling, the vast machinery of inequality that made the balls and the beautiful houses possible. Life for the filthy rich during Regency England was extraordinary, excessive and ultimately unsustainable. It was a world that couldn't last and didn't, swept away eventually by the forces of reform and change. But while it lasted, it was a spectacle unlike any other, a monument to what humans create when some have everything and see no reason to share it with anyone else. Sources and references. This narrative was constructed using information from multiple historical sources and scholarly works on the Regency period. Davidoff, Leonore. The Best Circles, Society Etiquette and the Season. London, Croomhelm, 1973. This work provides detailed analysis of social customs and the London season during the Regency and Victorian periods. Foreman, Amanda. Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. London, HarperCollins, 1998. A comprehensive biography of one of the most famous women of the period, offering insights into aristocratic life, politics, and personal struggles. Hill, Bridget. Servants, English domestics in the 18th century. Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1996. Detailed examination of servant life, hierarchies, and working conditions. Kelly, Ian. Beau Brummel, The Ultimate Man of Style. New York, Free Press, 2006. Biography of the fashion icon that explores men's fashion, social nobility, and the Prince Regent's circle. The Fae, Deirdre. Jane Austen, A Family Record. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 2004. Provides context for genteel but not wealthy life during the period. Mingay, G.E. English Landed Society in the 18th Century. London, Routledge and Kegan Paul, 1963. Comprehensive study of land ownership, estate management, and aristocratic economics. Poole, Daniel. What Jane Austen Art and Charles Dickens Knew. New York, Simon & Schuster's, 1993. New York, Simon & Schuster, 1993. Accessible Guide to Daily Life Details During the Georgian and Victorian Periods. Rubenhold Halley. The Five. The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper. London, Doubleday, 2019. While focused on a later period, provides valuable context on working-class women's lives and poverty. Sales, Roger. Jane Austen and Representations of Regency England. London, Routledge, 1994. Literary and historical analysis of the period and its representation. Thompson, F. M.A. English Landed Society in the 19th Century. London, Routledge and Kegan Paul, 1963. Examines the transition of landed aristocracy through industrialization. Tilliard, Stella. Aristocrats Caroline, Emily, Louisa, and Sarah Lennox. London, Chatto and Windus, 1994. Group biography of aristocratic sisters that illuminates 18th century elite life extending into the Regency. Tomalin, Claire. Jane Austen, A Life. London, Viking, 1997. Biography providing social and economic context for understanding the period. Uglow, Jenny. In These Times, Living Through Napoleon's Wars, 1793 to 1815. London, Faber and Faber, 2014. Broad examination of British life during the period, covering all classes. Vickery, Amanda. Behind Closed Doors at Home in Georgian England. New Haven, Yale University Press, 2009. Detailed study of domestic life across social classes. Wilson, Ben. Decency and Disorder. The Age of Cant, 1789 to 1837. London, Faber and Faber, 2007. Examination of the contradictions and hypocrisies of the period, covering both elite excess and moral reform movements. Primary sources consulted include contemporary letters and diaries from aristocratic families, including the Devonshire House Circle correspondence and Byron's letters and journals. Contemporary periodicals including The Gentleman's Magazine, The Ladies' Magazine, and La Belle Assemblée, which documented fashion, social events, and customs. Etiquette guides and conduct books of the period, which detailed expected behaviours and social rules. Parliamentary records and debates, particularly regarding the Corn Laws, Game Laws, and reform efforts. Contemporary novels, particularly those of Jane Austen, Maria Edgeworth, and Fanny Burney, which reflect social customs and attitudes of the period. Visual sources including satirical prints by James Gilray, Thomas Rhodenson, and George Cruikshank, which provide commentary on the period's excesses and scandals. Architectural and household inventories from great houses, including Chatsworth, Blenheim, and others, documenting the physical environment of aristocratic life. This story synthesizes information from these and other sources to create a comprehensive picture of life for the wealthy during Regency England, combining factual historical detail with narrative engagement to bring the period to life for modern readers.